Okay, welcome everyone. It is 11:30, so we're gonna move on to our Lake Superior keynote. Before we hand it over to Nancy, I wanted to just kind of give a little plug for our afternoon events. So this afternoon, starting at 1:15, we will have 3 concurrent sessions. The first is building resilience in the Lake Superior Basin using green infrastructure and natural management to reduce flood impacts. The second is Maingan, ecological and cultural importance of Lake Superior wolves. And then we have Superior Makers, a celebration of regional arts and water appreciation. Those are hour-long sessions from 1:15 to 2:15. So please grab your lunch after Nancy's talk and come back and join us at 1:15. And with that, I will introduce our speaker. So I'm really, it's my honor and pleasure really to introduce Dr. Nancy Langston as our Lake Superior keynote speaker. Nancy is the Distinguished Professor of Environmental History at Michigan Technological University and was trained as an environmental historian and an ecologist. In addition to authoring dozens of academic articles and popular essays, Nancy has written 5 books. Her 4th book, Sustaining Lake Superior, An Extraordinary Lake in a Changing World, published in 2017, focused on the interconnected histories of the health of watersheds, humans, and forests in the context of climate change. Her most recent book, titled Climate Ghosts, examines climate change and its effects on migratory wildlife in the North. Nancy has been recognized as an environmental historian many times over, including receiving the Distinguished Service Award and the Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Society for Environmental History, receiving an honorary doctorate from Umeå University in Sweden, and numerous fellowships from organizations including the Fulbright Program, the Mellon Foundation, Marshall Foundation, National Science Foundation, the National Humanities Center, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Nancy was also recently awarded the Distinguished Scholar Award, which is the highest honor in her field. So obviously we're really very happy to have Nancy joining us today. So please, wherever you are, give a warm welcome to Nancy Langston.
Thank you so much, Erin. Can you hear me now?
Yep, sounds good.
Great. Okay, it's a great honor to be here, and it's wonderful to see Erin again. She was one of our PhD students at Michigan Tech in the Environmental and Energy Policy program. So it's wonderful to see her thriving. I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm here on the shores of Lake Superior on the Keweenaw Peninsula, which is located within Ojibwa homelands and ceded territory established by the Treaty of 1842. I'm in the shared lands and waters of Native American nations in Keweenaw Bay, Lac Beau Desert, Bad River, Lac Coudray, Lac de Flambeau, Red Cliff, St. Croix, Soquogan Mole Lake, Fond du Lac, Mille Lac, and Sandy Lake. So here we go. I think many of you know that climate change is affecting Lake Superior profoundly. In fact, climate change is causing Lake Superior to warm possibly faster than any other large lake on the planet. Some of you may have seen these extraordinary images adopted from Catherine Hale et al. And what they show is the way that climate could migrate. Under higher emission scenarios, our summer climate could go from up there on Lake Superior to the equivalent of in Oklahoma. The North Woods may soon transition into an Arkansas type forest. And this is kind of extraordinary. The naturalist John Burns wrote, "That's so difficult to imagine, so close to what we can only think of as science fiction, that we have such a hard time conceiving of the possibility. Yet there it is, looming on the horizon like the eerie blue sky that precedes a tornado." So how does one address the coming of a tornado, John Burns asks, much less the coming of a global environmental upheaval? So one of the key things I want to stress is we still have important choices. The climate is changing, our watershed is going to change, but the choices we make right now could, for example, under a lower emission scenario, shift us just to Michigan rather than all the way down to Oklahoma. So those choices are critical. And when I started to write my fourth book, Sustaining Lake Superior, about Lake Superior, my goal was to write a hopeful book about climate change in the North, a narrative of resiliency and recovery, not just collapse and despair. And I have to admit, over the past 4 years, there were times when that was really hard to sustain that hope. But what I've been asking all along, as an ecologist and now as a historian, is how can paying attention to the past help us understand why environmental protection and regulation has been necessary and effective? How can understanding the past empower us to become involved for a better future? So in Sustaining Lake Superior, there are two core ideas. First is we're not remote in the Lake Superior watershed. And the second related idea is we're not pristine and we can learn from past recoveries. Lake Superior is indeed now remote from many urban centers. It takes 10 hours to drive to Detroit from where I sit right now. But it was and it remains at the very center of Anishinaabe homeland. Atmospheric currents bring chemicals from China, toxaphene from Russian and African fields accumulates in the lake trout that swim in the waters where we live. What is global? Financial markets, building booms, building collapses, coronavirus pandemics, becomes local in the most intimate ways today as those chemicals accumulate within our watersheds, within the other creatures that make up those watersheds, and within our bodies. And yet, this isn't just a story of fear. I want to tell a little story. A couple of years ago, while I was sitting on the shores of Lake Superior for 18 years now, I've spent summers over by Cornucopia, just outside of the Apostle Islands National Lake Shore. And when I was sitting on the shore of Lake Superior, drinking my morning coffee, a pileated woodpecker came for a visit. And it's a rare day now when we don't see pileated woodpeckers. The bald eagles nesting nearby perch on icebergs this morning that are drifting down from the winter's ice pack. And just last week, one eagle lifted off and dived and caught what I think was a small lake sturgeon, which are back inhabiting the watershed where we're living. The common loons are about to make their way back into our watershed. My neighbors the other night were arguing over whether that was really a mountain lion they caught on their trail cam the other night. And later this afternoon, we'll hear about the wolf and the Anishinaabe people. And often we're lucky enough to hear the howls of our brother creatures now denning in the county forests. Wolves whose recovery has been tremendous, but are now under attack again. Bears are now so abundant that they've become a bit of a pest. And what's interesting about all these species is 40 years ago, when I was young, few people figured any of these animals really had a chance up here. Settler invasions into indigenous human and more than human communities, starting in the 16th century, led to dramatic changes in the Lake Superior watershed, driven first by beaver trapping, then by mining, iron mining, copper mining, gold mining, and then by logging, first to serve the mining industry and then to serve a growing lumber industry. And then deforestation and following that, farming attempts destroyed the habitat of many birds, mammals, and fisheries. And the erosion that followed clogged the tributaries into Lake Superior and the estuaries with pollutants and with sediments, causing devastation to fisheries and to the human communities that relied upon those. After World War II, change accelerated. Industrial pollution boomed across the globe during the post-war economic recovery. And mines and pulp mills along the shore of Lake Superior became the focus of an enormous amount of industrial development. And those industries dumped their toxic waste into local waters. Distant industries released toxic chemicals that moved from their sites of production and consumption into Lake Superior. By 1960s, the lake was, at some observers thought, at a tipping point, with the possibility of eutrophication and irreversible pollution. But much to everybody's surprise, Lake Superior has witnessed substantial recoveries in my generation. Forests and many of their inhabitants have returned after the devastation of the lumber era. The toxic waste sites left after the mining and paper booms have been at least partially cleaned up. Lake trout, once nearly extinct, spawn abundantly in the lake once more, one of conservation's great success stories. And of course, none of these recoveries is complete. The new forests are indeed very different from the forests that were logged and farmed so quickly. Invasive species threaten aquatic ecosystems. Local women wrestle with concerns over how much lake trout it's safe to eat when they're pregnant. And new mining developments have threatened to slice off entire mountainsides. Communities struggle to balance environmental justice concerns and economic hope for the future. So we live in a world of profound change, and above all, climate change is now affecting Lake Superior with extraordinary power, remobilizing contaminants that communities thought had vanished. Lake Superior is already warming. This is a beautiful drawing by a children's class based on the work of Dr. J. Austin at Sea Grant and University of Minnesota. What it shows is air temperature is increasing about 1 degree or 0.6 degrees Celsius per decade, but the water is already warming twice as fast as the air. And that has profound effects on interconnected lake communities. For example, ice cover declines have been profound. If you just look out the window, you'll see some ice cover declines. And this has big effects on our economies, on our culture, on the culture of ice fishing. Snowfalls are changing. I typically race in the Great Bear Chase, which is a cross-country ski race. And the race course organizers are really struggling this week. We've had 2 days of rain, and that was not predicted that these kind of changes would happen so quickly. We know that climate change will affect boreal forests in particular. 15% of the land surface on Earth is boreal or very northern forests, but they contain 30% of terrestrial carbon storage. And we see increase in fires, increase in temperatures, increase in insect epidemics. And those changes can have profound effects, not just on the forests, but on the human cultures that have long depended and coexisted and transformed these forests. We all know about fisheries changes, in particular sea lamprey, which almost drove lake trout to extinction, are predicted to increase with warming temperatures. Storms, the Edmund Fitzgerald was a forerunner of the kind of increase in intensity that's predicted. And we're already seeing some of these storms. For example, this is a storm from Houghton. Let's start with Duluth. Before 2012, the record Duluth rainfall had been just over 5 inches in 24 hours. And on the June 20th rain day, more than 10 inches fell in that day, caused tremendous flooding, as those of you who live there can remember. You can see, I don't know how that car got in that hole. There were lots of news stories that the polar bear escaped the zoo. The polar bear did not escape the zoo. They just escaped their zoo exhibit. It was actually the seal that escaped the zoo and showed up looking in a bank window a little later that day. 2016, another round of very intense precipitation affected many northern Wisconsin communities. For example, the Bad Reservation in O'Donnell was cut off. The state highway was cut off for days. 2018, we had very intense flooding, the Father Day floods in June here in Houghton, Michigan, that actually killed one child in the community and devastated the community. We're still trying to repair from that. So these are 3 of what are called typically 500-year precipitation events. And that means they have happened in the past, but much less frequently, every 500 years on average. And yet we've had 3 in 6 years. And that intense precipitation has all too often resulted in sediment flows and flooding and combined sewer overflow. This is the state park where we normally swim. You're not going to swim in that. And in fact, combined sewer overflow is predicted by the EPA to increase 70% in Great Lakes communities over the next several decades because of climate change and associated changing precipitation. Researchers have also noticed what these beachgoers are noticing in cornucopia, blue-green algal blooms in the nearshore environment, which are really rare and have the potential to become toxic algal blooms. These have happened 3 times each summer following the intense precipitation event. And Bob Sterner, a professor at University of Minnesota, Duluth, has worked to try and understand how, if those are associated with intense precipitation from climate change, and if they have any historical background. Climate change is also affecting the movement of toxics into our watersheds and bodies. And so part of what I'm working on is, what do we do with all this information? How can we look at the past to understand it and to figure out what to do next? And one of my arguments is that pollution is nothing new. And in the past, people just didn't sit back and say, oh, we want jobs. It's great. Don't worry about it. In fact, they struggled. They really worked to address pollution problems. They valued economic development, but they also valued clean water and healthy ecosystems. So communities around Lake Superior, starting with the first pulp and paper companies in the 19th century, have struggled to address pollution concerns, and often they met with some significant successes. So the nature of pollutants has changed since World War II with persistent synthetic contaminants, but nevertheless, exploring the successes and failures of past pollution control can help us devise more resilient strategies for a globalized warming world. So, for example, as soon as industrial development intensified in the region during the 19th century, people began arguing about those industrial wastes. What can we do? This is a pulp pollution down on the Wisconsin River. And some of the earliest efforts to control pollution actually worked surprisingly well, for they rested on understandings of natural resiliency that made a great deal of sense at the time and still have a lot to teach us. 2 ideas were key. The first one was dilution is the solution to pollution, or the belief that most toxics don't do much harm if they're sufficiently diluted. And planners at the time thought Lake Superior is the biggest lake by surface area in the world. It's like a huge bathtub. We can dump some pollutants in and it'll be fine. They'll get diluted. What they didn't realize was that in the nearshore estuarine environment, a thermal bar created by the different temperatures actually held pollution very close to human communities and to the nearshore environment, where many of the nurseries for fisheries were located. The second key idea was what we know as assimilative capacity. And this refers to the ability of ecosystems to absorb and break down pollutants. So, for example, in healthy ecosystem, pollutants are being released all the time. Every time a deer poo in the woods, there's E. coli, there's bacteria in that feces that could contaminate watersheds. But healthy watersheds that are well oxygenated can actually assimilate and break down a great deal of those pollutants. And so this is what early planners and sanitary hygienists knew as assimilative capacity. And they tried really hard to figure out what the assimilative capacity of streams and lakes were so that they could limit the amount of contamination dumped into those streams. So some modern scholars have kind of made fun of these concepts, saying that they were just apologies for industrial development. But I argue that they actually encompassed understandings of resiliency, and they assumed that human activities were always part of larger ecosystem processes. And so damage from human activities could be healed by ecosystem processes as well. So what was cool about those ideas is they saw us as living within bounds, within ecosystems. But in the early 20th century, as industrialization intensified, that industrialization began to pull apart the ecosystem relationships that had lent assimilative capacity to freshwater ecosystems. So, for example, when beaver were extirpated from watersheds, it took time for those streams and rivers and meadows and wetlands that they'd helped create to break apart and lose their resiliency and their ability to break down pollution, to sequester it, to capture it. But few observers recognized at the time when you pulled beavers out of a system, you also pulled apart its ability to heal, to slow the flow of floodwaters as well. When those forests that we talked about were leveled so quickly, the ability of trees to pump pollutants out of the air, out of the watershed, and sequester them in the soil diminished as well. But because few observers had realized at the time that forests and beaver and wetland had helped to break down industrial pollutants, even fewer observers realized that all these changes had reduced the capacity of watersheds to lessen the harm of pollutants. After World War II, new persistent mobile contaminants such as DDT, toxaphene, PCBs were produced and released in extraordinary quantities, often outside of our watershed, but these were mobile contaminants, atmospheric contaminants, and they made their way through precipitation into Lake Superior, which at the time was so cold, it held onto those contaminants. It became what we call a sink for pollutants that had traveled thousands of miles. So in the late 1950s, new understandings of mobility and global pollution began to change the conversation about pollution. Unsettling research from nuclear testing showed that the North was no longer a pristine, remote place protected by its distance from industrialization. Rachel Carson herself got access to declassified results from nuclear testing by the US Army. She got access to this in the 1950s. And she found that northern communities, Inuit communities, most distant from Pacific nuclear testing, were showing some of the highest levels of radioactive contamination. The Sami this held for as well in the Arctic, in the Scandinavian Arctic, and it held for Inuit peoples in Alaska and Canada. And to Karsten, this suggested two key ideas. First, that certain pollutants could mobilize and make their way into distant places. And second, that dilution wasn't offering much protection when some contaminants could biomagnify in organisms, increasing in concentrations millions of times greater than their initial concentrations in water. So Rachel Carson and Silent Spring connected the biomagnification of radioisotopes with persistent pollutants being made by industry, such as DDT, PCBs, and toxaphene. She put the picture together and challenged people to rethink what we were doing. And at the same time, local citizens concerned about pollution from growing mining developments, such as the enormous reserve mine and processing facility on the Minnesota shore of Lake Superior, people were getting really confused about this. This is the world's largest taconite plant, and it was right on the shores of Lake Superior, dumping contaminants, dumping the tailings that were contaminated with asbestos-type fiber right into Lake Superior. And local citizens began to complain about this, saying it was affecting their fisheries, affecting the health of the watershed. And the policymakers from the state and the federal government initially said, don't worry about it. Pollutants were staying in place. So all the stuff dumped at Silver Bay was staying right there. And they were just local concerns that you could manage with local agreements. And they said dilution is going to be the solution. State and provincial experts, they said, could partner with industry and encourage the adoption of a few new technologies that might contain that pollution locally. But two women were not convinced. They read through Rachel Carson, Verna Mize here in Houghton, and Arlene Leto on the Minnesota North Shore. They learned of her research about pollutant transport, and that made them more and more concerned about the asbestos tailings being dumped into Lake Superior, and increasingly suspicious that dilution was going to be the perfect solution. And these two women channeled their love for Lake Superior into political action. At first, the companies laughed at them. These were the two biggest mining companies in the world. They said, you can't stop us. You're not scientists, you're housewives. But they channeled their love for Lake Superior into political action. They went to lots of scientific meetings, tried hard to understand the science, worked with scientists, and they worked incredibly hard to stop the dumping of asbestos-contaminated tailings into the lake. And nobody thought they had a chance in whatever at first, but they persevered. They worked with the IJC, International Joint Commission, and eventually they pressured the EPA, the new Environmental Protection Agency, into taking action. And they were motivated by looking at the other Great Lakes. What they realized was we were part of interconnected systems. And they were convinced that what was happening to other Great Lakes at the time, such as Lake Erie being declared dead, might happen to Lake Superior. So meanwhile, at the same time, the new EPA was commissioning a project of artists and photographers called the Documerica to travel around the US, and they really focused on the Great Lakes. And they said, document pollution. Don't take just pretty pictures. Take pictures of what's going on and talk with community leaders. And Verna and Arlene began to see these haunting images of Great Lakes transformation. These pictures of massive amounts of dead alewives and invasive fish along Lake Michigan, pictures of contamination in Green Bay, PCB contamination that got so terrible that the poor mayor just ordered perfume dumped into the bay because he had no power to regulate the industry to stop that contamination. This haunting image of Ohio, where a local woman holds a jar of well water polluted by a coal company. This image from the Duluth Water Labs here in the basin, where a Jordan Dellafish, the spine was severely deformed just by background levels of methyl mercury that were present in the water. And so Arlene and Verna worked together, created a powerful grassroots movement to stop that dumping. And they were working in the footsteps of tribal communities around the basin who advocated for tribal sovereignty and the power to manage watersheds and fisheries and forests on their own terms. And they fought powerful battles over the next several decades, continued to fight them to assert tribal sovereignty and to make sure the treaties continue to be adhered to. And around the basin, tribal communities continue to advocate for a powerful vision of sustainability and resilience, one where health is not just about individuals, but about relationships between wild rice and fisheries, between fisheries and people, between watersheds and communities. We can find resilience from the tribes. We can find resilience from all these other communities. For example, the extraordinary work that's been going on to restore the headwaters to reduce sediment flows into Lake Superior. Wonderful stories, inspiring stories of fisheries restoration, such as restoration throughout Wisconsin of the sturgeon. The Menominee Nation, as many of you know, have been playing an incredibly powerful role in really innovative techniques to restore migratory sturgeon. The Lake Superior Binational Forum, to which I belong for quite a few years, had as its motto, our vision statement, water is life, and the quality of water determines the quality of life. We were fortunate enough to meet with Josephine Mondeman, who I think many of you knew. She's an Anishinaabe woman who in 2003 began her water walks, concerned that pollution was harming the Great Lakes. Every spring, she walked around a different Great Lake, leading an annual spring walk where she carried a container of that precious water. Thousands upon thousands of people joined her in her walks. Eventually, she led over 17,000 miles of walks to show us so powerfully how interconnected human and more than human communities were. And I also want to recognize the passing of Joe Rose, a Bad River elder who walked on quite recently, and many of us mourn because he was an extraordinary person who worked for the communities of Wisconsin. Like Mize and Leto, Joe Rose and Josephine Mandeman channeled their love for Lake Superior into political action, creating grassroots movements to work to restore watersheds and fisheries, to prevent contamination, to assert treaty rights on ceded territories. So communities, indigenous and settler colonial, around the basin continue to advocate for a powerful vision of sustainability, one where health is not just about individuals, but about interconnected relationships between watersheds and communities. Mize and Leto, Josephine Mandeman, and Joe Rose all leverage scientific information with education and political savvy. And they focused on health effects as a way to bring diverse communities, left and right, settler, colonial, human and more than human, together, because we all care about the lakes and we all have a role to play in restoring and advocating for these extraordinary waters. Their vision of health was never focused just on people, but expanded to include the web of relations within these Great Lakes. So a couple of lessons from the histories I've written on these Northern Great Lakes. So, one thing I found out was that industry will act to protect the environment, but it does it when government and citizens force them to do so. Governments will act to protect the environment, but they do so when citizens get involved and force them to act. The Environmental Protection Agency eventually went to court to shut down reserve mining companies' asbestos dumps into Lake Superior, but they did this only after local citizens spent years protesting, gathering signatures, showing up at hearings, working with scientists who were all willing to risk their jobs for a broader vision of health. So in a democracy, technology is important, government is incredibly important, industry is important, but they alone can't save the day. It's grassroots pressure, community involvement, individual education and involvement that ultimately lead to change. And in these stories of the past, I kept reading like Verna Mize at moments where she just felt things were hopeless. It was insurmountable, but she just kept plugging along. The problems just seemed like they weren't going to budge until suddenly they did. And this one particular place, Lake Superior, is intimately connected to the rest of the globe. It's not a remote, pristine place. It's not a place outside of history. It's a place that experienced rapid ecological degradation because of unrestrained exploitation. And it's a place that has substantially, but not fully recovered because of efforts by all of us, efforts by citizens, efforts by scientists, efforts by state and federal agencies, and the International Joint Commission. And we can and we really must continue their efforts to ensure a healthier watershed and healthier communities for our shared future. So thank you so much. I need to thank Michigan Tech, the National Science Foundation, 2 grants that have funded this work that resulted in Sustaining Lake Superior and my new book on lake sturgeon, common loons, and woodland caribou in the Upper Great Lakes Basin. So thank you so much. And I think we have plenty of time for questions and conversation, of course.
Yes, we do. So I am going to just pin our videos so that folks can see us. And we're gonna go through some audience questions. So let's see if we have any questions yet. Remember to submit them in the Q&A.
Yeah, we don't have anything in there yet, but please, everybody, now that we've listened to the presentation, ask your questions. Nancy, I was particularly amazed by the concept of local people and local regions will deal with these local pollutants and it'll be fine. And that's a little bit horrifying from a modern perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are lots of contaminants that have been around for a very long time, such as mercury, that have powerful local effects, but also global effects. So for example, we know it's not just recent industrial PCBs and toxic and things like that. It's natural contaminants as well that have been unnaturally concentrated by industrial processes. So a few years ago, the Minnesota PCA Pollution Control Agency released a report that showed that 10% of newborn babies born in the Lake Superior Basin have toxic levels of mercury in their blood at birth. And I told this to a colleague of mine, Casey Huckins, who's a fisheries biologist, and he said, which species? And I said, us, human species. It's not just the fish that we have to worry about. And he was shocked. And that mercury is partly coming from some local sources. Mining is the #1 local source, but it's mostly coming from combustion, from coal combustion, in other places and much more industrialized areas. So just because we don't have any big, heavy industry right here, or not much heavy industry right here, doesn't mean that we can ignore what's happening with industrial combustion. So local things matter, but global processes also matter.
Absolutely. We have our
So
first
I let
question.
Kat and Jamie into, I got little things saying they wanted to join the Zoom room. So I just clicked admit. So hi, Kat and Jamie. I'm not sure I really meant to enter you into Zoom, but you can show your pictures and talk with us too. Or not. Hey, Kat.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
I just
I'm
popped
gonna
in the
read.
information.
I'm going to read the first question, and then if Jamie and Kat have questions after that, we can definitely get there. First question is, here in Wisconsin, we have lake associations which inventory and protect local resources. While far greater in scale, is there anything comparable in the Lake Superior Basin?
Oh, that's a great question. And I do want to say that these local lake associations are incredibly important. And so I'm not trying to dismiss them when I say we need to act locally, but also regionally and globally. So actually, I'm going to put you two on the spot because there are lots of groups working on the Lake Superior watershed, but it's really hard to work on the entire lake all at once. I'm a member of one of the committees. In fact, at 2, I have to go join a Zoom call by a group called the Binational Program. And so this is a group that has a whole bunch of different committees, and there's scientists and administrators from Environment Canada. I'm pointing north towards Canada, and our Environmental Protections Agency. Our committee, Extractive Industries, is run out of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So I would say like the GLIFWIC pays a lot of attention to the entire Lake Superior, the 1842 treaty waters, but also 1854 and other treaty waters. The Binational Program tries to look at it as an integrated system, Canada and US. Groups like this, these watershed associations that pay attention to the lake rather than just to lakeside associations also work. UW Extension, Sea Grant works on it. So a lot of people that are here that I'm putting on the spot right now are part of groups that I think are really working on trying to integrate local monitoring with an entire watershed approach. But it's hard when you're the biggest watershed in the world, right? Or the biggest lake in the world.
And I just wanted to say, I don't know if the question, because it says lake associations, which are often, citizen led, if they're kind of thinking like, is there sort of a more grassroots lake-wide organization? I don't know if you want to speak about the Binational Forum or your previous involvement in that, or I don't know, could be a nice history to share.
Yeah, the Binational Forum was part of the International Joint Commission, which starting with the Great Lakes Water Quality Acts in 1978, when people were realizing that Lake Superior, like the other Great Lakes, were really changing. The two nations came together and formed a process for trying to make sure the lakes could recover. And part of that process was declaring Lake Superior a zero discharge demonstration zone. So we weren't supposed to allow any more discharge of any of the dirty dozen, mercury, dioxin, a host of others as well. And to make sure that happened, a group of citizen stakeholders called the Lake Superior Binational Forum was formed with half its members from Canada, half its members from the US, representation from industry, from lake associations, from citizens, from academia, lots of representatives from Indigenous communities, First Nations, and the tribes. And we got some funding from Environment Canada and from EPA to meet 4 times a year in different communities, but we were really citizen-led, unpaid. And unfortunately, several years ago, first Environment Canada and then the Environmental Protection Agency decided to cut the funding and felt that they did not need citizen stakeholder representation for the lake. Which I feel was really unfortunate. I love scientists, I love large government agencies, but I really feel like people who are within the basin really have incredibly important perceptions and perspectives. And the stories we heard, 4 times a year as we went to different communities were just so powerful and so moving, and they really changed our lives. So I hope these kind of groups can come back together again. So like the Lake Superior Stewardship Association now brings school kids together and brings lots of educators and field experiences, runs out of, well, we see lots of things at Michigan Tech. I'm not sure exactly where it runs out. So there are lots of cool programs going on, but unfortunately the forum is no more. The program's still going on. That's a more formalized group that we actually advise governments.
We have a couple more questions coming in the chat. Oh, quite a few more questions coming in. So first one, what is the best way to lobby the DNR to change policies that are detrimental to the environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, because Wisconsin DNR, Minnesota agencies, the Michigan, we're called Eagle now after Flint, they changed the name. Those agencies are really interesting because I think in general, there may be political appointees at the top who may have political biases, but the agency staff, in my experience, are incredibly devoted and incredibly hardworking and really passionately love the place and the so-called resource, and really want to do the right thing, I think. But I think they often don't have the tools that they need to do that. Sometimes just lack of funding, just sometimes being overwhelmed. But a lot of times because the laws on the books really restrict their policy options. And so my number one thing is I would advise work with your DNR staff in the field, get to know them, go hang out with them, go on field trips. But you don't necessarily need to lobby them. You need to be present, support them, say, hey, let's go, collect these samples. Let's work with the tribes as sovereign nations, which is required by law, but doesn't always happen. But where lobbying really matters is at the state legislature level, because that's where the rules that tell the DNR what they can do happen. So for example, with the Nestle's over here in Michigan, there were some 80,000 individual comments against allowing Nestle's to expand its extraction of groundwater to put into little bottles to ship out of the basin, which is basically, they don't get charged for it all. It doesn't raise any taxes. They get charged a tiny amount. And it technically falls within the Great Lakes Compact, but boy, is it a huge exception. You could drive a bus through. So 80,000 people wrote comments saying, we hate this, don't give them the permit. I don't know, 5 people said, what a great idea. But the DNR acted to agree to the permits. And people are like, what do you, why we lobbied you? But they had to follow the law. They could, and the law specified under which conditions they could grant a permit, and the permit met its conditions. And so the lobbying that needs to be done is at the state level, at the legislative, at the level of the legislatures where these rules get written. And there you can have a powerful effect. When I used to live near Madison, before I moved to Michigan Tech 8 years ago, I spent so much time in the state legislature in the House just talking with, as a member of the Binational Forum, part of my job was to go and meet with legislators over and over again and to give our consensus position on taconite mining and protecting watersheds and respecting tribal sovereignty. And I think it was, well, I don't know how effective it was. I think it was very powerful because they are the ones who write the law and they're the ones who can change the law. And DNR staff have a tough job to do. Great question.
We have another one that has quite a few upvotes. You stated the citizen concern is the catalyst to get government on all levels to take action. What do you think is the next concern that grassroots efforts should focus on?
Oh, interesting. Clean water. No, I think climate change, climate change for me is the number one issue for protecting clean water and healthy watersheds. One example I didn't talk about of incredible efforts to protect our Great Lakes, which are more than 21% of the entire world's fresh surface water. I mean, sometimes we forget we live in these Great Lakes states and we are caretakers in some ways of the world's most extraordinary fresh surface water resource. And the decisions we make from moment to moment, from day to day, are going to affect the future fresh water for many generations to come, 7 generations, 70 generations. And so we have this really precious stake. And one of the extraordinary things that citizens throughout the Great Lakes really pressured their legislators, their governors, to come together and form what's known as the Great Lakes Compact, which basically eliminates withdrawals if it's larger than the size of a bottled water or in so-called straddling communities from the Great Lakes, because there was this proposal by a Chinese entrepreneur to fill tankers with water from Lake Superior and ship it all the way to Asia. I mean, it would have been literally a drop in the bucket, but it terrified people because they wouldn't have broken any laws. You could take any water you wanted out. And more realistically, there are a lot of proposals that have been put forth in the past couple decades to just pipe Lake Superior and other Great Lakes water to the desert Southwest. A lot of people saying, oh, with climate change, there's going to be more and more and more drought in the Southwest, in California, Colorado. We have all this water, we're not using our water. It's just hanging out here. So let's stick it in an aqueduct and send it to California. And it's not going to happen because of the Great Lakes Compact. It's an extraordinary transboundary agreement that will really protect it. So we need to continue to lobby to keep that agreement strong, to get rid of the exceptions. And we also, so I think protecting clean, fresh water is the number one thing. And I think the way we do that is by keeping water withdrawals from happening, tightening up the sort of exceptions. Peter Annan at Northland College at the Mary Burke Freshwater Institute wrote a wonderful book about this, Water Wars, that's just been updated. And the other related thing is to do everything we can to move beyond coal and other fossil fuels, because that is absolutely number one. And we have this extraordinary opportunity now with the new administration to really see changes happen and really put our voices behind them, because our elected officials, even more than they want donations, they want to be reelected. And that's where we have a powerful voice to tell them what matters to us.
Alex, can I sneak in a follow-up question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I am thinking about how you draw the connection, Nancy, to contaminants that are coming from very far away. And for me, that's, like Alex said, it's alarming. It's something you don't naturally think will happen. Do you know of any environmental organizations or maybe even political leaders that really are tackling that issue? Like maybe it's with working with folks far away somewhere, like, making that connection from like the local to the global. I wonder if you have any places to refer us besides your book, if we wanted to that bigger picture.
Yeah, I think there's some great examples here at Michigan Tech with the When Can We Eat the Fish project that was a collaboration between the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, Val Gagnon, who was then a PhD student, run out of the Great Lakes Research Center, to focus both on local community health, the health of Anishinaabe men and women and children, when eating fish is incredibly culturally important, and also just physically really important. It's an incredibly healthy source of protein and omega-3 fatty acids. And yet that fish is contaminated with contaminants that don't come from KBIC, Keweenaw Bay Indian community, but come from coal combustion largely around the world. Mercury is one of the main contaminants. And so they worked with scientists, both from within the tribe and from settler colonial communities at Michigan Tech, and put together an extraordinary program with international scientists, local scientists, tribes from around the region, to actually help community members understand what's in the fish, and even more importantly, work at international levels to strengthen agreements to stop this global transport or the initial transport of mercury and other toxic chemicals into watersheds, where it then moves into distant ecosystems. So I think that's a great example of scientists and community members, local action and global action. Also, a group of people at the working out of University of Minnesota, Duluth, have been doing a really wonderful project creating, it's called COPE, creating coastal organizations, people, ecosystems, a big NSF-sponsored multi-organization with tribes, with scientists, with local communities to really work on these connections between local and global and help local communities really respond to these rapid environmental changes with a focus on toxics as well as sediments that move those toxics into the watershed.
Thank you.
Bob Sterner, Lucinda Johnson. Those are some cool names to remember. You know them, Kat. Yeah.
I see one more question at the moment. So audience, keep the questions coming if you got them. How, as a property owner that has a shoreline and water flow from inland that goes into the bay, whom and how can we do our best as mindful stewards of the land for future generations?
That's a great question. When we think of, there was a great program run out of UW Extension, and a number of people that are here on Zoom can talk about these much better than I can, but basically to slow the flow, to think of your shoreline as a kind of sponge, plant native plants, don't cut trees down, really work on creating healthy ecological communities rather than sort of lawns between you and the lake. And Kat or Aaron or Alex, do you want to talk more about how people can get help as landowners, as part of lake associations to do that really great work?
Yeah, I would
I think
say I could direct
Go ahead, Aaron.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say I could direct you to our week organizers at the Wisconsin Extension Lakes program, and we can certainly put their information in the chat, and they are all over the Event Mobi webpage. So their staff has been very busy this week planning the event, but they have do a ton of training for Lake Association folks and help with finding grants for projects. And Kat, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, they have like fact sheets, bulletins. You can speak to a specialist on that, or you can also get a hold of your local county extension office. And there's one in every county and many tribal communities, to reach someone who can either help you directly or put you in touch with someone who can help you, such as a Patrick Goggins, located out of Rhinelander, is an excellent specialist that can help you with this work. Also, I would reach out to your local lake associations because they probably are doing this work and may have on the ground information ready to go for you that's localized for your lake or community area.
And funding sometimes to help out our native plant sources as well. And it's really fun to work with native plants and to rethink the way you see that lawn or that shoreline. Yeah. So another citizen-led program I want to talk about a little bit, and this is with my next book that looks at common loons and woodland caribou. Did you know we used to have so many woodland caribou in our watershed? Woodland caribou were once the most widespread deer species in the upper Great Lakes region. They went all the way down to Detroit, although it wasn't Detroit at the time, their populations. And there's just one small population left in the Lake Superior watershed up on the North Shore of Lake Superior that I work some with the Michipicoten First Nations community on trying to restore them. Are trying to protect them, not restore them. But common loons were also really in trouble. And many of you may be familiar with Loon Watch. And so many lake associations have really made an effort to help monitor loon nests and slow speedboats down and keep canoeists and kayakers and boating communities from getting too close and disturbing the nest, from creating wakes. Have worked with the flowages to help monitor or to be careful about water fluctuations, which also can strand or drown loon nests. And the Sigurd Olsen Institute at Northern College has done amazing work for decades now with Loon Watch, just to get people really invested in thinking about the loons in their lakes. Loons don't nest right in Lake Superior. It's too wavy for that. It's at one small population on Isle Royale where it's super protected from waves. But we see a lot of floaters, or the so-called mostly young males, gather together in big groups in some of the bays of Lake Superior, practicing their calls, because you have to learn how to be a loon, in other words. And so all these local projects are so important, and people here love loons. And I really want to encourage people to get involved, but we also have to recognize loons only spend part of the year here. They spend much of the year migrating down to the Gulf or sometimes to the Atlantic coast. They can actually change their whole physiology to become saltwater birds instead of freshwater birds. I mean, we could never do that. We couldn't just start drinking salt water, but loons have evolved this incredible ability. But threats to loons now are really from kind of ordinary oil production, the gold, the huge not the Exxon Valdez, right? The big BP spill in the Gulf a number of years ago had devastating effects on populations, and just ordinary oil spills are really contaminating and reducing the ability of loons on their wintering ground to return to our lake. Similarly, mercury is a really big issue for loons. The lead in sinkers, and hooks and sinkers, up to 40% of loons in some lakes die each year from lead in fishing tackle and guns. And so there are things that we can do locally that are really important. There are things we can do to really support bans on lead tackle, because we have great alternatives. And, if it's killing 40% of the breeding loons, it's something that's a great way to lobby if you love loons. And also to really work to stop fossil fuel production, because it's not just contaminating our world and bodies with mercury, it's also really hurting the migratory species that we love so much: caribou, loons, which I think we all love, and lake sturgeon as well.
Just wanted to add that loons are a great species to involve lake associations in discussions of climate change, for the reasons why Nancy said. People love loons, and we can talk about issues of water fluctuations and things that are affecting them, but also warming temperatures is increasing blackfly predation on chicks. We have that added stress as well. And so you can link up place-based evidence that we're seeing in terms of loon populations being reduced. Audubon Society said Minnesota may lose its loon population by the end of the century. But we can see changes in our local lakes on loons, and then we can match that up with what we're seeing with what science is saying is going to be happening in terms of projection of temperatures, water level gusher events that can wash away nests. Get people to think about what they're seeing and what is happening in the habitat that supports this species, this being that is so important to many of us. And it's a great entry point to getting people to think about climate change differently.
Great point, Kat.
All right, Nancy, we have about 2 minutes left to be able to respond. So if we didn't quite get to your question, I apologize, but feel free to reach out on the EventMobi platform. So our last question for you, Nancy. Intrigued by the concept that contaminants may be elevated and persist in nearshore portion of Lake Superior due to thermal gradients. Does that apply mostly to harbors, estuaries, or the entire lakeshore?
It's actually the entire lakeshore. So thermal bars, they're called, form around the entire lake. The size and the distance it goes out into the lake depends a lot on the bluff, on whether it's a bluff or a long beach, how shallow the lake is. But it's just part of very large lakes, how they change their temperatures, it's very easy to get in the weeds very, very quickly, and we don't have time, but there's some great limnology textbooks I can send you to. But basically, temperature differences, the surface warms much, much more quickly than the subsurface temperatures, and twice a year, basically the lake kind of does this big shift. And until that shift happens, temperatures near shore are much warmer, warm much more quickly, and then cool much more slow, and then cool more slowly. Cool more quickly as well. Sorry, I'm getting this mixed up. Basically, temperatures near shore are affected very differently than way, way deep in the lake. We're not as deep as Lake Baikal, but we're still an extraordinarily deep lake. And so nearshore conditions just turn out to hold nutrients closer to shore, which is partly why so many of our fish really take advantage of these nearshore environments, partly why in the previous session we heard really inspiring discussion of the Nearshore Estuarine Reserve Program. And those estuarine reserves are so, so important, and why the Bad River, the Kakagan sloughs that they protect are so important. That's what 40% of remaining estuaries and wetlands on Lake Superior. So they're really, really crucial to protect, even though they also do hold in some of the contaminants. They also hold a lot of the nutrients and the nurseries for young fish, and really important for birds and herps, reptiles and amphibians as well. So they're really cool nearshore communities supported by those thermal bars.
Thank you so much, Nancy. This has been really fantastic Lake Superior keynote. I want to let everybody know, because I'm sure you're going to want to show this to other people. We are recording, and we'll be posting this online, probably in a couple different places later this month. So hopefully you'll get a chance to rewatch it or something like that. And we'll make it freely available as well.
Erin, can I make a last pitch?
Yes, yes.
I want to really encourage, I know all of you are so busy, but there'll be a wonderful panel on wolves in a little while and we mentioned them before. And also Tia Nelson is doing a keynote later today around the whole state. And she's the daughter of Gaylord Nelson. And Gaylord Nelson was someone who was extraordinary, and Tia is even more extraordinary as an embodiment of combining science and good governance and working with local communities and really spending their lives to protect and restore the lake. So she will be so inspiring, and lots of other great talks too, but those are the ones
Thanks
I
for
wanted
those
to make sure people know about.
Yeah, and it's very appropriate. It's, I believe it's Women's History Month, right? So that'll be great. And I'll put information in the chat as well for our Stories of the Land to Which People Belong tonight hosted by Superior Water Story Corps. So thanks everybody for joining us, and come back at 1:15 for our afternoon sessions, and yeah, have a good rest of your day.